Thank you. You are the brave people. You've stayed all the way for sick leave and taxation. The discussion about health and wealth and work time reminds me of the question that was put to the oil billionaire J. Paul Getty, who was asked, how does one become wealthy? And he said, it's quite simple. There's 3 things you have to do. 1, get up early every morning. How many of you got up early this morning? Okay, good. Work hard all day, beyond 6 hours probably. Yeah. Find oil. Okay. Well, I'm here to talk a little bit about where's the money going to come from and what's the system of revenue or taxation that might support moving toward a new economy. But I did want to maybe, as a part of context, just comment on some of the things today and set the stage for a discussion of revenue. I think that the subtitle of the conference is Best Policies for a New Economy. And we've talked about some of those. I think Kristen, with her mother anagram there, sort of identified a number of things. Some of those are policies that are going to cost money. Some of them are reforms within that may not cost appropriations. One of the themes clearly today has been the growing inequalities of wealth in the United States and income. That's actually really the work that I do mostly, is these issues of inequality. And in fact, I wanted to mention a couple of resources. We have a website, a portal called inequality.org, which is a sort of a data and commentary and resources on these issues of inequality that includes chart packs and things that look at the racial dimensions of inequality. We have a weekly online newsletter called Too Much, which, and I actually have a clipboard here if anybody wants to just sign up for it. So it's just a really good roundup on these inequality issues. But I think that, as Stephen said, underlying this conversation about imbalance in work is the ways in which, for the last 30 years, we've pulled apart dramatically as a society, and that those inequalities matter. Stephen talked about how they matter for healthcare. I think it's implied about what it matters in terms of work, the experience of work, both in the workplace and as a low-wage worker. And I think what we haven't necessarily talked about are the distortions that come from concentrations of wealth and income and corporate power, which I think we're about to live through an election where we are going to see what concentrated wealth throwing its weight around looks like. And I think in a couple of weeks there'll be some more analysis about that. But as of this morning, it's about $250 million of money flowing into attack ads where we don't know the source of where that money's coming from, but it's largely individuals and large corporations. So these themes of inequality, I think, are one of the undercurrents of our conversation. And then I think when we talk about what is a new economy, and I think Juliet Shore is going to speak to this tonight. I'm part of something called the New Economy Working Group, which is the Institute for Policy Studies and Green America and Yes, the magazine, and a number of other organizations. And when we talk about this issue of a new economy, we're basically saying that when you hear the conversation about economic recovery and how we're sort of going to go back to something that we've known in the past, we don't believe that. We think we are not going back to any economy that we have known previously. We're not going to go back to a model of consumption based on borrowing and debt and extreme levels of borrowing and consumption. We're not going to go back to an economy of this sort of perpetual growth machine driven by debt and cheap energy. That the ecological reality is that the end of cheap energy is over. We're going to be entering into a new territory, that there are ecological limits to just how much carbon we can dump into the atmosphere and how much pollution and how much we can consume and fill our landfills. And that we're coming up against those real barriers. The rest of the world sees it much more clearly than we do. We're still sort of sleepwalking. But I think when we talk about a new economy, it's an invitation to say, where are we going? We are transitioning into a new economy that I think will be it'll be characterized by much more regionalization, localization of food systems, of energy production, of industries. It's going to be focusing on the real economy, the manufacturing of goods and real services, as opposed to the sort of phantom wealth economy of financialization that we've experienced. We're heading that way. And the good news is there's a lot of really interesting community activities and organizing. There is a transition town movement, which is there's some 70 to 100 U.S. transition towns. These are communities coming together to prepare for a new economic and ecological future and be proactive about that. And think about what does it mean at the local level, at the regional level, to have energy costs dramatically go up? What would it mean to deal with the impact of climate change in terms of extreme weather and potential impact on agriculture and other things? So there's a group of people they're not doomsdayers, they're proactively thinking forward to what is it we need to do to plan. And in my neighborhood, we have something we call it the New Economy Transition Group, which is doing educational events and programs and doing community planning, transportation, jobs of the future, local industry, substitutions, all kinds of things. So I think it's very exciting. And at the very individual level, a lot of those communities are forming common security clubs. These are face-to-face associations of people coming together to personally prepare to face unemployment, underemployment, and face the future together. So I think that's the thing, and I think that the real danger is if we're not proactive and don't proactively plan for this future. And, you can think of some of the policies we've talked about that will help us move to a new economy, but clearly the kinds of things like infrastructure for new public transportation, the green energy infrastructure, making sure that the next food bill is actually a food security bill that's increasing food security at the regional or local level, the healthcare investments that Stephen is talking about. These are all the kinds of things that we need to do to prepare for an orderly transition to a new economy. So that brings up the question of where's the money going to come from? How are we going to pay for that transition? And you've probably noticed we're not in the most tax-friendly political environment at the moment. But I think that's one of our challenges, is to how to talk about taxation and revenue as the way that we're going to pay for this transition to a new economy. It's one of the things we have to do. And I think where we're raising the money is going to have to change. So John DeGraff this morning alluded to 100 years ago in July, the New York Times story he was talking about with President Taft saying you should have 3 months of vacation. A month later, August 31st, 1910, Theodore Roosevelt stood up on a kitchen table in a small town in Kansas and gave perhaps the most remarkable speech of his life, we call the New Nationalism speech. And it was actually written in part by Gifford Pinchot, his former Forestry Service head. But it was this amazing speech waving the flag and saying, and he's no longer president, he's post-president, and he's basically saying the concentrations of corporate power and wealth are undermining all that we hold dear. And that it is destroying our democracy, it's destroying our economy, it's corrupting our politics. We have to act. And his solutions were the progressive income tax, which didn't exist at the federal level, and an inheritance tax. And he was very specific about a graduated inheritance tax, that the higher up the fortunes, the great fortunes, should be taxed. And I won't repeat some of the colorful language he offered in that speech, but it was essentially an urgent call. And 6 years later, a couple of years later, Congress passed, and then the Supreme Court ratified the 16th Amendment, instituting income tax and inheritance taxes. And there's no question that those taxes reduced the extreme inequalities of the first Gilded Age and were a very important part of the tax system, but also in terms of the healthy functioning of the society. Now, here we are presently in the second Gilded Age. So here we are in the second great period of inequality in U.S. history. and we are dismantling the progressive tax system. There is no estate tax this year. It was phased out into 2001 Bush tax cuts and went away. George Steinbrenner, Dan Duncan, a billionaire from Texas, some of the great fortunes of our time are passing on to the next generation without any form of an inheritance tax. But even more, I think, serious is that in the last 50 years, we have, as a country, shifted taxes off of wealth onto wages, off of large corporations onto small businesses, off of federal government onto states and localities, off of today's taxpayers onto tomorrow's taxpayers. We've been shifting the tax obligation. We've been shifting the bill, kicking it down the can, punting. And so, and one simple example, the 2001 tax cut, which is currently being debated, that was given to households with incomes over $250,000. We borrowed $700 billion in order to give the wealthiest taxpayers in this country that tax break. And if Congress retains it, we'll borrow another $800 billion over the next 10 years to retain that tax cut. So we're moving completely in the wrong direction. And I think that one of the things that I would say, the question is, what should be the system of revenue or taxation going forward into this new economy? What are the dimensions of it? We have a very antiquated tax system in a way at the state and local level. We tax, we have a very regressive tax system at the state and local level. So what should we be thinking about? And tax systems always have implicit values, and in the past, it was viewed that you use a tax system to tax the bads, to tax the negative behaviors, the destructive behaviors. So 100 years ago, taxing concentrations of wealth that were distorting democracy was seen as had a social value. And I would say the new tax system should have three dimensions. We should still be concerned about concentrations of wealth and the extreme inequalities, but we should also be looking at how can the tax system reduce pollution and certain kinds of wasteful consumption. And thirdly, how can the tax system tax one of the serious bads in our current economy, which is financial speculation, the sort of short-term pursuit of making money at accelerating paces. So it's still relevant to talk about taxing concentrations of wealth. I'm part of a group called Wealth for the Common Good, which you know Bill Gates and Warren Buffett and others who have come out in favor of retaining the estate tax. There's a proposal put forward, a responsible estate tax policy that has major support from many of the people who would actually pay it. So Wealth for the Common Good is taking the lead on that. My colleague Ann Manning is here, is a Midwest organizer for that. So I think those are some of the proposals that are currently out there, letting the Bush tax cuts for the wealthy expire. On the issue of pollution and waste and excessive consumption, the tax code the tax code of the future should be looking at transitioning, putting a price on carbon. I know that's been a tough slang, but a carbon tax. Again, I think we're going to start to see business leaders. Young Bill Gates has come out in support of a carbon tax. I think we're going to be organizing business leaders who understand the value of putting a price on carbon, the necessity of that, and putting a price on other kinds of pollution or excessive consumption. We have a tax system where 7 states tax food purchases, but one of the most regressive kinds of taxes, whereas we should be taxing these other bads. Third, this whole issue of speculation, financial speculation. I was sitting on the plane coming here from Chicago, and I got on, the woman next to me was reading Fast Company magazine. Fast Company is from Boston. I know the people who put it out, but I sort of jokingly said to her, I'm kind of more on the supportive of slow company myself. That one of the things that money has moved too fast. There's huge amounts of money moving into the phantom economy, the speculative economy, and there's a couple of ways that we can deal with it. One is to increase the cost of this antisocial behavior. A financial speculation tax, a 1 penny tax on every $4 of financial transactions would raise $150 billion a year at least, probably more, That would include currency, hedge funds, derivatives, all those investments that drove the economy off the cliff, all that activity, I wouldn't call them really even an investment, all the gambling that crashed the economy. Why can't we put some speed bumps in that and raise revenue from that kind of behavior that can be used to offset all the negative impacts of financial speculation? So I think those are some of the dimensions of a tax system for the future. And let me close with two stories. It's late in the day, so I think I'll stick with the stories here. But one of the things that I think keeps our debate about taxes stuck, Kristen used that phrase this morning too, where we have a number of kind of places where we cannot have a conversation, a national conversation, and clearly taxation is one of them. And I do a lot of talk radio, and I don't know why I do it sometimes. Maybe I feel I have to atone for something, but so I'm often on late night talk radio shows, and I was on one recently. It was like 11 o'clock at night. My family's in bed. I'm in my pajamas, and I'm on sort of Whack the Liberal AM 850 or whatever. And so somebody called, and even the host is saying, "Call Chuck Collins and tell him why he's completely off the wall. The lines are open. Keep the calls coming." So I get a call from Hillsborough, New Hampshire. Says, "Listen, this guy Collins, he's talking about why we should have an estate tax. I'm sick of it. I built my business. I have 30 employees. I never got any help. I never got any government assistance. I was working hard. Everybody else was goofing off. Those are those people who went home at 4:30. I was there till 11 o'clock. I missed my kids' soccer games. I've made these huge sacrifices. I've paid taxes all along the way. Again, I haven't gotten any help, and I don't have to pay any more taxes. And besides, that money's going to go and support a bunch of worthless parasitical activity and our bloated government, and you know the story, right? So on and on. The reason I'm sort of, and I have to say, I've heard that narrative of individual success. I call it the great man theory of wealth creation, and there's definitely a certain gender, thing about it, which is I didn't get any help. I have to sometimes say, well, did you ever have a mother, or did you go to high school, or did you get some? Is there a road that goes up to your office? Is there do you use the internet? Do you use the public airways in any way? You kind of go down the list. But there is a lot of people out there who really believe they did it alone. But the thing about it that's not to dismiss is that individuals do matter. Individuals who start companies, individuals who take risks, we should find ways to celebrate them, lift them up. But what happens is we just have this very sort of narrow narrative of success. So another story is a couple years ago when Clinton was president, President Clinton, Congress actually abolished the estate tax. And we got a call from the White House saying, can you send some business leaders to a press conference? President Clinton is going to veto the estate tax bill, which, by the way, was sent to him on a red tractor, emphasizing that this was going to save the family farm. The death tax was the death of the family farm. And a couple weeks later, David K. Johnston came out here to Iowa in search of that farm that had been lost to the estate tax and couldn't find any. But anyway, President Clinton asked for some business leaders, and one of the business people that we sent to Washington and went to the press conference was a guy named Martin Roth. And he stood up and said, listen, let me tell you why I support the estate tax. I'm a business owner, but I grew up in a very poor family in Syracuse, New York. And my parents had no extra money. But I went to a really good elementary school, and I got an education, high school and elementary school, and I went to a library, and this library was open on weekends. And every time I went there, this librarian who knew me said, Martin, I have a book for you. And she knew I was interested in electronics, and so she would always find something that was. So he says, I grew up and had a pretty good education, but somebody else paid entirely for it. And I went to college on a scholarship, and I got a good education. Somebody else paid for me to go to college. And then I went into business in the technology sector, which was largely built with public investments in research. And then I went to hire my employees. And where did I find them? I found them from the great universities of our land. Somebody had paid to train my workforce and bring them up in the latest technologies. And in fact, as Martin tells the story, he had a piece of intellectual property. He had designed a product, had patented it, but it was stolen, and he went to court and sought a remedy and won. So he says, yeah, somebody else built this incredible property rights and legal protection system and system of orderly remedies where my property was protected. He says, look, then I sold my company for $40 million. Are you telling me, this is Martin Rothenberg at a press conference in the West Wing with President Clinton. He says, are you telling me I don't have an obligation to pay back the society that made this entirely possible for me, so that some other kid out there who's not born rich cannot have the same opportunities that I had to do what I've done? He says it's unthinkable. It's un-American. I'll pay an estate tax. It seems fair. It's not going to impoverish my children. My children are going to be fine. I'm going to give money to charity, but I should pay back the society. And I remember President Clinton, who's usually not at a loss for words, so I said, wow, this is the best of America. And it was really that story where those two competing narratives, and I think that the challenge of this stuck tax debate is to bring those together. How do we celebrate and recognize the role of individuals, but how do we see and name and support and sustain the web of public institutions, private investments, institutions like this university, the commons, if you will. There is a knowledge commons, there's an ecological commons, there's this social commons that we've built together. No individual owns it, and yet taxation is how we sustain it and pass it on to the next generation undiminished. And Bill Gates Sr., who I've mentioned this, he and I wrote a book together, and I got to do a lot of public speaking with him. And he said, there's something like our society is sort of in this arrested development phase where we don't think about legacy anymore. But the estate tax and progressive taxation it's an economic opportunity recycling program. You're fortunate enough to have this move forward in this way. You have an obligation to pay back so that others have the same opportunity. He says, I think we should call it the gratitude tax. The thankful to be growing a business and living in this society with this amazing commons and commonwealth that we have together. So I think I think we can talk about the policies that move us toward a new economy and how to pay for them, but in the end, we have to talk about what kind of society we're going to have, what do we owe, what did we receive that we didn't even pay for that makes our lives possible, the gifts that we've received, and our obligations to pass them on. And a couple weeks ago, I was giving a very similar talk to the Retired Men's Club of Norwood, Massachusetts. About 150, 200 men, Boston suburban community, all Caucasian, people of European heritage. And I was talking about these issues of taxation, and I said, but I'm just curious, I don't often get to talk to a group of men all in their 70s, 80s, 90s. How many of you got, after World War II, a debt-free education? I said to the assembled group. 3/4 of them raised their hand. So how many of you got help buying your first house? Through Farmers Home Administration, or these are the generation, the 1940s, 50s, 60s. How many got help, FHA mortgage, to buy your first house, first generation home buyer? 3/4 of the men in that room raised their hand. How many of you got help with a business startup of some way? About 1/4 of them raised their hand. How many of you think that was a waste of taxpayer money? Ha ha ha. None. It was great. One guy stands up, he says, it was the magic carpet to the middle class. That was the best investment anybody could have ever made. I said, are any of you helping your kids? Everybody laughed. Yeah, we're all helping our kids. We're helping our grandchildren and kids go to college, buy houses themselves. I said, okay, so you guys got on the ticket onto the train, but this generation, unless they have you as as grandparents, don't have that ticket. I have a coworker who graduated from Holy Cross College 2 years ago. She has $100,000 in school debt. She's 24 years old. What is wrong with that picture? What happened to intergenerational solidarity? So I think we need to change the way we think about taxation to be the price we pay to live in healthy communities, an orderly society where we maintain our obligations to the future. Thank you.